Hi, good morning, Professor Glover. We've seen a lot of refugees come and settle, especially in that southwest Sydney area. We've got 6,000 Syrians down mostly in the Fairfield area. Does that give your university the various departments and schools of study opportunities to engage with some of that and understand that in any particular ways? Is that kind of reaching out to the changing demographic, maybe?
I think that it's important to note that Peter Shergold, our Chancellor, is also the Coordinator General of Refugee Resettlement in New South Wales. So Peter, and someone who's had a deep connection to multiculturalism in Australia from his time as a senior bureaucrat. And so Peter's very strongly committed to not only within the Coordinator General role, finding ways to ensure that resettlement is effective and compassionate and appropriate in the New South Wales context, but equally keen to see ways that universities can reach out and support those new communities, those new refugee communities, and the existing refugee communities in Western Sydney. So we engage, I think, in a variety of ways. The scholarship program provides an opportunity for students to find a way into the university where they get financial support. That's crucial, and we're building that program and offering more and more of those students. We have, I think, nearly 500 students on humanitarian visas at the moment at the university, and by far and away the most significant number in the country. And I think there are some challenges in relation to that, but we are very committed to that. We also have a large number of our researchers that are working with communities, and our humanitarian and Development Research Institute's an example of that, with Andre Renzar, who runs that, and he's engaged with the African community in Western Sydney. So the connections that we have are deep and varied, and I think that's true of other universities. It's not just Western Sydney, but the nature and the context of our region gives us, I think, a greater opportunity and responsibility to engage too. And we're certainly seeing, as I mentioned, those three young refugees, young students of refugee background who obtained their scholarships at the weekend. They're very impressive. So you can see pretty quickly they've overcome language problems very quickly, completed the early stages of their education very, very quickly, and they're achieving at a high level, and we need to see much more of that. We had a question at the back there.
Yes, with such a multicultural and multi-faith campus, do you suffer any tensions and concerns, and what steps do you take to deal with those?
It's a good question. I think that we have a remarkably safe and supportive culture across our campuses, and I'm very pleased about that. We engage with particularly Muslim Students Associations very regularly. There's not one particular group that is spread across our campuses. From time to time, and it's been in the media, we've had situations that have arisen which have created some tension in the community, more due to the hype of the media than the reality on the ground. I mean, it's often students, I think, trying to develop an interfaith dialogue, but it's being misrepresented at times. And so we reach out to support those student groups to manage through those circumstances, rather than taking any sort of draconian action to try and stop what is, in many ways, very effective discussion. I mean, there was a case in point in the Daily Telegraph commented on a particular event that was organised on our Parramatta campus by one of our Muslim student associations with a particular speaker, with a particular background, and those students separated men and women as they came into the room. This created quite a tension. The Daily Telegraph ran a big story, but those people in the room, it wasn't the most thrilling discussion. It was certainly not in any way contentious. It was really exploring Islam and what it means to young people, and there was a free and very valuable conversation that went on. The journalist who had come into the room fell asleep for most of it, so his report was somewhat tainted, I think, by the fact that he hadn't actually stayed awake long enough. So no, I think we have, I think, campuses and relationships which are very positive. But one of the things recently that the sector has responded to has been the report by the Human Rights Commission on sexual harassment and sexual assault on university campuses. And one thing that came out of that, very similar to work we do on anti-racism, and that's public transport challenge to and from campus. So if I was to say where are most of the challenges occurring to some of our students, it's in the public transport system. And so, like many other universities, we're very focused on what we can do. That was certainly the case with sexual harassment, came out very strongly in that way, and in residential colleges. So I think the sector has a range of challenges to address in that broad area of discriminatory behaviours and inappropriate behaviours, and how do we ensure that we provide the safest possible environment. But I think by international standards, Australian universities do a great job, and I think we're very proud of what we're able to achieve.
Sir?
Thank you, Professor Glover. I must admit I am a graduate of UWS.
Oh, good.
My question is, with impending cuts in funding, it's more likely that maybe higher education will cost more. Would there be a risk that we're going back to the pre-Whitlam era?
No, I don't think that's the case. I think both sides of the major parties in the political spectrum, not every party, but major parties, and certainly the Greens as well, are very committed to the continuing of two very important national policy settings in Australia that have served us well. One is the demand-driven system we operate under, which allows universities to enrol as many students as we can attract, and we're funded for those students by the Commonwealth and by the Higher Education Loan Program. So the demand-driven system has been a very important policy instrument for growing access to Australian higher education broadly. So that policy setting has bipartisan support. It has challenges, and the Minister at the moment is challenging it, but largely it has bipartisan support. The other, of course, is the fact that since 1989 we've had income contingent loans for Australian students to assist them so that no Australian student should be disadvantaged entering university. Now, the Commonwealth is suggesting to make some changes to that, not the core element of what makes income contingent loans such a valuable means of funding access to higher education, but to change some of the thresholds for repayment and repayment rates. And I think that's regrettable. That does transfer a burden to students. But I think in the overall picture, the combination of the demand-driven system and income contingent loans will continue and will, in my view, provide what is the world's best system for accessing higher education. And it has been exported. The United Kingdom picked up income contingent loans. There are parts even of Canada that are looking at income contingent loans. I think America can't get its head around some of this stuff for various reasons, but I think we've done well in that regard. And this is one of the reasons, I think, why. And not just for those students of refugee background, but you talk to parents whose young children, they've come from a refugee context and they study in Australia and they go to university. Australia provides this wonderful way of saying you don't need to pay your fees up front. You can defer the payment until you're earning money post-graduation through the taxation system. This is a wonderful way of providing world-class education for someone without the financial burden when they're studying, and to manage it in a way that doesn't increase the size of that burden when they graduate. In other words, it's indexed to inflation, not to interest rate change, so it doesn't grow over time. So I think we're fortunate that they're still in place. I don't think you need to be concerned about those settings, but certainly the government is trying to tweak them. And whenever that happens, we should be alert and stand up and very strongly say this is a policy that should remain.
We do have some more questions. I'm just mindful of the time. Ahmed, how we... One more question. Madam in the front row.
Thank you, Professor. My interest is... I'm interested to know, with the changing labour market and robotics potentially replacing humans for employment, what is the university doing? How is it thinking of pathways to employment for those graduates of the university?
That's a very, very good question. And it's one that not just Western Sydney University, but every university is deeply thinking about the jobs of the future. And we're all aware that, you know, this digital revolution will change the nature of the labour market, will change, you know, there's various estimates of as much as 40% of the jobs that we have today will disappear over the next decade because of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, and so on. So there is serious concern about that. Most of the industrial revolutions that occurred in history have actually, after a period of uncertainty and instability, which is what we're really feeling at the moment, those revolutions have led to more jobs being created than less. There is a concern here that this might be the first one where actually fewer jobs are created because of the revolution. And I use an example in meetings. I often quote a comparison between Kodak, as an example, as a company that once existed. Kodak had, when it first reached $1 billion turnover as a company, had 70,000 employees. And it had taken 60 or 70 years to grow to that size. Instagram took 5 years with 13 people to turn over $1 billion. So if you compare, the digital revolution can dramatically change the nature of the economy. So universities are very conscious of this. I think we're doing a range of things to try and anticipate the future. Many young people who will graduate from universities even today will not have the same sort of careers that was the case 10, 20 years ago. They won't have a single job, they'll have many. Their careers will take a much more twisting pathway. They won't engage in the workforce in the same way. They won't be employed by a single organisation or a couple of organisations for long periods of time. They're likely to have contract work, they're likely to work part-time, full-time, they're likely to have different sorts of ways of engaging with the workforce. But there are a few things that I think are very, very important. One is increasingly STEM skills are going to be important. We're talking about science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We need to improve the STEM literacy of our students in a large number of ways. It's very clear that there's a premium that I think will be a growing premium attached to graduate skills as opposed to those without higher education qualifications. So there's a real need to ensure we encourage as many people as possible into higher ed. The challenge will be different forms of credentialing of those higher education qualifications. You'll see much more flexibility, much more micro-credentialing is an idea that's getting a lot of attention. So people can be credentialed for demonstrating particular skills, and they can demonstrate them quickly and be credentialed for them, and that can be important in the workforce of the future. And I think lifelong learning, which we've talked about for a long time, will take on new meaning as people will need to re-skill and change their skills over time. So universities are conscious of this, and we're all working on it. Just one last comment on this. Jeffrey Bleish, who was the former US ambassador to Australia during the Obama period, came back in February this year, and he gave an address, a keynote address to the Universities Australia conference. It's available on the conference website. It is a truly inspirational speech, and it touches on two very important issues. One is America in the post-Trump era, the post-truth, fake news, Trump era, and how America will work its way through those challenges. But it very much talks about the changing nature of the workforce because of disruption. And one of the, without giving away what is a beautifully articulated and eloquently expressed speech, but he talks very passionately about the personal care industry, the health services and personal care industry that has to grow so dramatically as almost a compensation for jobs being lost in other sectors. And that's because we are ageing. In Australia, those health service industries are so important. You know, they're likely to grow 20, 30% over the next few years. So there's a shift. We're aware of some of the early indications of that, and universities, I think, will be adept at responding to it. But the last thing I'd say is there are also going to be new competitors in higher education. It won't just be universities providing those credentials. So you'll see other, both private sector, we see that already, but we'll see it in different ways, And I think we'll see big corporations entering the higher education space because they will want to credential their staff in a very forensic way. And that may be a competition. There's a whole lot of things around blockchain that will come into this, ways of giving integrity to micro-credentials that people are talking about. So it's a really fascinating space. It deserves an entire breakfast session to talk about it. So it's a very good question.
Thank you very much.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll join me, round of applause for